두 번째 강연인 파푸아뉴기니의 중국 진출 현황을 시작하겠습니다. 발표자인 그레엄 스미스는 현재 호주 국립대학 교수이며 중국의 1대1로 정책과 태평양의 건해삼 관련 프로젝트 경험이 있으십니다. 지금부터 발표 시작하겠습니다.
Good evening and welcome. Apologies for my unshaven state. I have a couple of small children and we're all in lockdown, so things are a bit below the usual standard. Anyway, delighted to join you for the conference and looking forward to the Q&A session very, very much. Questions when it comes to Q&A. So what I'll be offering today is a general overview of China's engagement with the Pacific region. Over the last decade or so, I've led a research team looking into Chinese investment in a range of sectors, including fisheries, but fisheries hasn't been our main focus. We've looked at China's engagement fairly broadly, encompassing investment, trade, migration across a large number of sectors, particularly retail and construction. So yes, I'll try to make some fisheries focused remarks, but what I'm aiming to do is give you a broad overview of China's presence in the region and perhaps some ideas of what its future trajectory in the Pacific might be. So what we'll cover is just the basic origins of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is not the be-all and end-all of what China is doing in the Pacific these days, but it is certainly guiding the activities of a range of actors in a way that we haven't seen previously, certainly prior to, I'd say, even 2014, much of China's engagement with the region was fairly uncoordinated, and basically you had actors in different sectors doing more or less as they please without a great deal of government intervention. That is no longer the case. I'll also talk about the drivers for this initiative in the Pacific and some of the pushback that has been going on from Pacific actors. Then I'll focus on Chinese enterprises in the Pacific across a range of sectors. One thing that hasn't changed a great deal is that China's engagement with the region is very much led by companies, largely state-owned, but with some strong exceptions, such as Huawei in the ICT sector. And finally, I'll finish up looking at state-corporate relationships and the geoeconomics of China's engagement with the region. And some photos there just to illustrate a few of those themes. At the top there, we have Michael Sogavare meeting with the Chinese ambassador, the new Chinese ambassador, or the first Chinese ambassador to the Solomon Islands, and the project manager for CCECC, who, as a Chinese company, largely led China's engagement with the Solomon Islands and effectively acted on behalf of the Chinese state in securing the switch of Solomon Islands to away from Taiwan and to the People's Republic. Down the bottom, we have almost what we call a slightly different era of China's relations with the Pacific. On the left, you have Michael Somari, the late Michael Somari, often at times the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, and Shen Heting, the Director of China Metallurgical Corporation, which to date still holds the record for the largest Chinese investment in the region. That's the Ramu nickel mine. He, however, well, he's still alive, but he has fallen victim of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, which has certainly shaken up business for Chinese companies in the Pacific. It's certainly had quite a lot of fallout, not least of which Mr. Shen's demise. So looking at it in a global perspective, you can see that the focus of the BRI is not really on the Pacific. Originally, the BRI was conceived as a response to Obama's pivot to Asia. So in essence, they were looking to occupy space that wasn't occupied by the US, and also to provide an outlet for their industries and companies in the west of China, which is sort of a poorer region of China. So their initial push was very much into countries such as Pakistan and the rest of Central Asia. The Pacific was actually added on 1 year later when Xi Jinping visited Fiji. So if you like, the Pacific is kind of a bit of an afterthought in the Belt and Road. Now, while the money for the Belt and Road has dried up somewhat, and I'll talk about that later, the keenness of the government to coordinate different actors and to control different actors in the Pacific has not diminished. If anything, it has increased since Xi Jinping consolidated power in 2017, 2018. And even over the last 18 months, you've seen a much greater appetite for government control over China's enterprises in China and abroad. And you've doubtless heard all the talk about common prosperity, the idea that those who are wealthy will, like it or not, be sharing their wealth with the rest of China. So in terms of what does the BRI do for China, it's very much about playing to a domestic audience, as many things are in China. It restores China to its central place in the world. And this image here of Xi Jinping meeting with various heads of state. Notice, of course, Vladimir Putin is quite literally at his right hand, a signal in itself there. Interestingly, only one Pacific head of state was invited to this gathering, the Belt and Road Forum, and that was Frank Bainimarama of Fiji. Not the first country, however, to sign on to the Belt and Road. The first Pacific country was Papua New Guinea, and that was closely followed by Fiji. Timor-Leste also signed on, of course, very early in the piece, but whether or not to include Timor-Leste in the Pacific is another question. So the origins of the Belt and Road and are very much in China's domestic politics. It's basically arisen out of two initiatives, both of them which started under Jiang Zemin, so the previous chairman, so two chairmen before Xi Jinping. And one was a domestically focused initiative called Xibo Da Kaifa, which was basically open up the West. And this was a program to rebalance China's investment. The idea being that the western parts of China, shown here on the map, the western part of China, as you can see, physically occupies a huge amount of China, but in terms of development has always lagged behind. So the idea was by investing in infrastructure in these regions, they would improve trade and improve the attractiveness of this region for investment. And it was a bit of a failure in many ways, partly because it didn't extend beyond its borders. So in some ways what the BRI is extending this investment initiative outside China's borders. Hence those countries bordering it, with the obvious exception of India, were a major focus of the BRI. It also had a global equivalent called Go Global, or Zhou Chuchu. Here is Jiang Zemin meeting with Nelson Mandela. Obviously, Chinese companies had gone out before 1998 when this was launched. But again, much like the BRI, this was sort of an attempt to begin to coordinate Chinese companies overseas, who had already acquired quite a reputation for going their own way, certainly in the fisheries sector. That has been the case. Domestic drivers, in some ways, the BRI is, if you like, a result of a crisis in Chinese capitalism, a crisis that Korea itself has seen before, and also Japan and Taiwan. Korea's crisis, I think, occurred around about the 1970s, where you have this problem of excess capacity, just simply too much stuff for your domestic economy. So you have to find a way to use it up abroad. And the 70s, I think, in Korea was very much the time when large Korean construction companies really started to aggressively expand on the international stage. And much the same thing is happening for China now, as happened for Japan in the 1960s, and to a lesser extent for Taiwan in the 1980s. In this case, we have a picture of some cement And China has such a ludicrous excess of cement and concrete and these sort of construction materials that local governments deliberately build things badly so that they can remake them in 5 years' time. Labour is another thing that China for a while had in excess. So part of the driver for the BRI was to provide employment, if you like, for the men of working age. Demographic change in China and also the relative cost of Chinese labour means that this isn't the factor that it was, say, 10 years ago. Without wanting to be too critical of the physical specimen we have here before us, this, in some ways, this fellow represents the fact that to find able-bodied labour, you now need to go further and further into the periphery of China, and the further inland you go, or the further away from sort of mainstream areas, the more percentages you have to pay. You have to pay, if you like, 10% at each stage. So if you're reaching out into remote villages, the costs of bringing people out from these remote villages is greater, and generally their level of education will be lower. So yeah, so labour not quite the driver that it once was of China in the Pacific. In fisheries, as I understand it, the labour supply issue is quite an interesting one, in that the crewing of the boats will not necessarily be entirely Chinese. So a longer to medium term focus of China's engagement with the region is scholarships and training, and this is something that's been invested in a big way. And its focus is partly around influencing governments of the future to be friendlier towards China, and also encouraging, hopefully in the future, the adoption of Chinese standards across a range of industries. The attention tends to be on the internet for good reason, but just as much front and center of thinking are sectors such as telecommunications, the construction sectors, so things as simple as the adoption of Chinese construction standards rather than Australian and New Zealand construction standards. So these are a big focus of China's aid to the region. Now, I'll just let you, I'll give you a little bit of time to read this. So as a bit of background, Peter Kenaloria Jr. Is the son of the first Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands. In expressing these views, you wouldn't describe him as a mainstream individual because he was the Solomons representative for the United Nations for a long time. He got to deal directly with his Chinese counterparts, and so he understands the way China does business better than most. I'd say better than nearly everyone in the Solomon Islands. Now, the other reason for concern, and I guess the most prominent, what would you say, reservation Pacific governments have around China is this narrative around debt trap diplomacy. I'm a little skeptical in terms of the numbers. There are a few countries where China has got some serious levels, plays a serious part in the external debt of Pacific countries, most notably in Tonga, Vanuatu and Samoa. But I've included Cyclone Pam here because it illustrates, I think, why debt is a greater concern in the Pacific as compared to elsewhere. The increasing number of natural disasters you have in the Pacific means that you have a situation where what might not seem to be an onerous level of debt can be quite ruinous to a country because of these natural disasters. In the case of Cyclone Pam, this one natural event wiped off 2/3 of Vanuatu's GDP literally overnight. And the other reason you can see here is this, if you like, the Chinese citizens on the ground who, this is an image of the riots in Tonga, Nuku'alofa, where Chinese businesses were targeted as part of general anti-government riots. So it's also a complicated thing for China in that there's this dual narrative. One is People every day and in every way see Chinese people running the shops in their country, and they also, at a macro level, have a perception that their government is indebted to China and is thus likely to engage in corruption or do favors for China. So they don't see it, Pacific citizens don't see it in big geopolitical terms. They see it more in terms of the Chinese state is likely to be fostering corruption within their governments because as part of their own personal experience, that they're aware that their governments are corrupt. And China in some ways is easily blamed for the corruption of these governments. Tonga is no exception there. Here's some feedback from some of my interviewees on how China's projects work. Both of these bits of feedback relate to Huawei, who, as I mentioned before, were kind of the exception. So they're a private company, but in their dealings with the Chinese state and their dealings with Pacific states, they are probably the most aggressive and the most opaque of companies that we've looked at. And what they tend to do, and what many Chinese companies tend to do, is they work very closely with the relevant ministries. So in the case of Huawei, they will work closely with the telecommunications ministries. In the case of fisheries companies, for example, they work quite closely with NFA and try to, if you like, reverse engineer outcomes. So in this case, that Huawei even goes to the extent of literally going into government offices and not leaving until they get what they want. So that's as extreme as it gets. Generally, it's a lot more subtle than that. In the case of fisheries agents, if you like, we found a lot of evidence of customs officials being, if you like, persuaded to look the other way when there was smuggling going on. And in the case of customs officials, it's not a very difficult thing in Papua New Guinea to arrange because their salaries are quite low, and the payoffs from smuggling a bunch of sea cucumbers in the back of a shipping container is well worthwhile for a Chinese trader in sea cucumbers. So yeah, this kind of reverse engineering goes on across a range of sectors. Now, as I mentioned, the BRI is winding down in a finance sense. So this is just looking at one sector, the energy sector, and you'll see here from 2016 onwards, there's a very sharp drop off in the financing of energy projects by the policy banks. By policy banks, I'm referring to China Development Bank and China Exim Bank. In the Pacific, the only one of those of note is China Exim Bank. The reason being is that there aren't that many commercially viable opportunities in the Pacific for China Development Bank to fund. But essentially what happened here in 2016, 2015, you had a huge tightening in China's foreign reserves. And because of that tightening in foreign reserves, you have a lot less money flowing around in the portfolios of these two banks. So the debt trap concern is somewhat diminished simply because China Exim Bank doesn't have the money to throw around in the Pacific that it used to have. Now, looking quickly at the mining sector, here's a quote I'll let you read. So this quote from Shen Heting, who you saw on the first slide, the chairman of the China Metallurgical Group, the largest investor in the region. That represents, if you like, a very old school approach to investment. And I think partly explains why Shen Heting has ended up falling foul of the anti-corruption drive. He very much saw the Chinese government as owing his company a living and made some fairly terrible investment decisions. I would include the Rama nickel mine in that. But the company itself invested in a range of continents, in a range of metals, and completely overstretched itself. Ironically, the project that ultimately was his undoing was a project right here in Australia, where he made the rather unwise decision to get involved in a project called Sino Iron, which I encourage you to look up if you want a textbook case of how not to do investment abroad. So here is the mine site, and here are some of the barriers that they faced. Over 130 kilometres from the mine to the refinery, which you see down the bottom, and also you'll see the final slide, a very diverse workforce. So this is again something that's common across a lot of sectors. Less so in fisheries, but certainly for large state-owned companies, often they, as this man describes here, they're made up of different companies. So I'll let you read this quote here. So as our team looked at this project a bit more closely, what we discovered was there were different companies within the parent company that were working with separate budgets, with separate staff, and to separate timelines. So the project was not well coordinated. Even though on the surface it was one company, you only had to dig a little bit to discover completely different corporate cultures, and indeed companies speaking completely different dialects. You had people from Shanghai, from Tangshan, from Sichuan, and whilst they could speak variants of Mandarin Chinese, they tended to speak their own dialects and very much distrust one another. So this is some of the time I spent up at the mine site, getting to know their practices. And here is some of the dissatisfaction that was expressed by the Chinese staff. So while Roman nickel is a bit extreme, part of what he's talking about there, the sending of good news back to headquarters and to SASAC, the State Assets Supervision Advisory Committee, this phenomenon of sending good news back to headquarters is very much prominent across all sectors. So if something does go wrong, it will tend not to get reported back to head office. And this is a problem in the Pacific because things quite often go wrong, particularly for companies that are inexperienced in working in the Pacific. The thing that stumbles or that trips up a lot of Chinese companies, regardless of the sector, is land ownership. This is one thing that Chinese companies really struggle to grasp in the Pacific, that you can't just bribe / deal with the central government and that will sort out all your problems for you. You need to work with landowners, you need to work with the lowest levels of government, and this is something most Chinese companies have not learned and are very reluctant to do. But without working with landowners, it's very hard to get a project of any size underway. So here are a couple of mines, and one on the left here, which involves a company called GRAM, Guangdong Rising Asset Management. It's a Chinese city-level state-owned enterprise that took over an Australian company and is now, on paper, one of the largest copper mining companies. If its project at Freda River goes ahead, that will be the largest investment in the Pacific. But again, there's huge opposition from landowners, and the Panos company, while it's a much more nimble operator than China Metallurgical Group, is still faces an uphill battle to persuade all of the landowners who will be affected by this massive mining project that their project is a worthwhile, worth backing. Zijin, I've crossed them out there, but they're back in business. They bought into half of the Porgera gold mine with a Canadian company called Barrick. So that is another example, if you like, of what appeared to be a failure in investment on the part of Zijin, and now through very skillful and rather relentless lobbying of the central government, they have eventually got their mining lease back, but not after taking a bit of a haircut. So here are some of the faces of the most prominent enterprises in the region. CCECC, as I mentioned before, are prominent throughout the Pacific. They're headquartered in Vanuatu, but they have been involved in what you would call effectively acting as the Chinese state in engineering the switch of Solomon Islands from Taiwan to China. They have also been involved in COVID diplomacy, whether it's mask diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy. They have been delivering supplies and delivering medical equipment on behalf of the Chinese state. Shanghai Construction Group is strongest in Samoa, and they also have a presence elsewhere. They built a wharf in Luganville, which got a lot of notoriety. A lot of people are concerned that that might have been the start of a military base in Vanuatu. That seems unlikely to happen, but there is a possibility that China will build a military base in the region in the next 5 to 10 years. Why? Simple reason, because they can, and the cost of doing so is very low. The cost to American primacy and American prestige, which has already taken a pretty big hit in Afghanistan, the cost would be enormous to the United States and very, very low to China. So that's why it might happen. Here is Huawei putting on a bit of a show of their smart city program. They will be there in every way in the future. They are both the most innovative company in China, the most aggressive investor in the Pacific, and no matter what Australia does at every turn to try to slow their progress, they will be back again next year. And here is one of those things I talked about, the COVID diplomacy led by CCECC in Vanuatu. Now here's a project I'll spend a little bit more time on than I usually would, because you are fisheries people. It's a very interesting project, this one. So originally it was meant to be 10 canneries that would be built in northern Papua New Guinea in Madang province. At the start, it was funded by the World Bank, or rather the IFC, so the private financing arm of the World Bank. And on paper, it's an excellent idea for Papua New Guinea, because obviously a lot of the value of their fisheries resource is lost upstream, if you like, because the vast majority of PNG's tuna is canned elsewhere, most notably in Thailand, the Philippines, and even in Europe. So the idea was very, very sound. But unfortunately, what happened was the PNG government lost patience with the World Bank, or rather the IFC, and they sought out assistance from China Exim Bank. China Exim Bank came on board and brought with them a Chinese company that, to be frank, no one had heard of before, called China Shenyang Technical Cooperation Enterprise, or something along those lines, a very small city-level SOE. So its total number of employees was around 100 at the most, and that was just according to their own propaganda, so it's probably quite a deal less than that. And what happened in this particular case was China Exim Bank put up a lot of money, tens of millions of dollars, but effectively, rather than what you would expect, which is often the Chinese contractor makes off the money, the Chinese contractor in this case was too weak. So the money for the fisheries zone was stolen by a combination of Papua New Guinea's Commerce Minister, his commercial partners, who were largely Filipinos, who had their own cannery also in Madang, and weren't wanting to be outcompeted, and the landowners, who are often blamed for not getting these projects off the ground, were largely passive bystanders as this money was stolen. Now, the management of PMOZ, the Chinese contractors, according to other Chinese companies, were constantly on the phone asking them to take over the project. So they literally called every other Chinese contractor in PNG and asked them to take over. The operation was basically just two guys. It was a man and his nephew sitting there stuck in an office, literally watching their money be stolen by Papua New Guinea officials and Papua New Guinea businessmen. So they were completely out of their depth, and this project, which is still on the books, people are still hoping it will go ahead, but the prospects of it working will be much greater if they can find a new contractor. Another example of the sort of model is companies like this, like PNG SJ. They're effectively spin-offs from other projects. So PNG SJ arose from one of the contractors at the Rama nickel mine site. So SJ in Chinese stands for Shijiu. And those of you who had sharp eyes on the previous slide will notice that one of the companies was called MCC 19. So they quite literally come out of that company. They use the same labor, they even use the equipment from the mine site to get a private business underway. Another example of quite a successful contractor is Guano Foreign Construction Corporation. They have become really, really successful and have kept the same project team there. All of these guys I recognize for the past decade. And they have extremely close relationships with the central government and the provincial government as well. So they, if you like, have the secret sauce of one, doing quite decent projects, but also doing a really good job of managing both central and provincial officials. This is probably one of the better known but less successful projects, the Beijing International Convention Center. I was there at the outset of this, and the company involved from Jiangsu quite literally had their entire workforce robbed by local, what would you say, local criminal elements who robbed them not just one day but 2 days, and then the company from Jiangsu flew home and didn't return for another year. Luckily, as with all things in China, they can do things in a bit of a hurry, so they managed to get the convention center finished in time for APEC. So here's sort of a comparative slide to look at the sort of variables you get in China's corporations in the Pacific. And you'll see there, second from the bottom, I've highlighted the problems, if you like, of Shenyang, this company involved in building the canneries in Madang. So whilst they had a great deal of autonomy in terms of head office, they ended up, I think, being a net negative to the Chinese state, simply because they lost control of their investment. Now, diplomacy is an interesting connection. This connection between Chinese companies and the Chinese state. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs traditionally has been greatly weakened, but one thing the Belt and Road has done is it's made the embassy, if you like, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs more central to China's dealings with the region. So in the past, you would have very much said that MFA ranked behind the Ministry of Commerce and behind a lot of the larger state-owned companies. The BRI, because it's a political project, puts MFA more at the centre, and it gives them a lot more leverage. That doesn't mean they get everything right. If you'll see this headline here, new Chinese ambassador arrives in Papua New Guinea, and they've gone and filed it in Xinhua under the Africa section. So you can imagine how this went down in Papua New Guinea when people got wind of it. And you do get this all the time. Even I was once involved in a project with a chap from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who was there to write up the country plan for both Tonga and Samoa. And until a week before he arrived in Tonga, he was under the impression that he was going to Togo. So the Pacific is far from front and center of the Chinese state's goals. It has, however, caused, I think the BRI has caused a huge diplomatic shift in the quality of people that you get arriving. So whereas in the past, if you like, the face of China was kind of carpetbaggers like Shen Heting, seen here meeting with the recently departed Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan. Here is the new PNG ambassador to the new Chinese ambassador to Papua New Guinea, engaged right from his arrival in a bit of vaccine diplomacy, and even, if you like, picking a fight with Australia over vaccine diplomacy. This is another thing that's changed. In the past, China was quite deferential to Australia in the region, Australia and New Zealand, and now they are very much at every opportunity trying to if you like, provoke and humiliate Australia, which is a huge, huge change from the past. Their representatives, however, are much more capable than the ones we've seen we've seen previously. They're better educated, their English is better, and they have more capacity to both help Chinese enterprises and to work with local partners. And here's another example, Liu Lin, who's MOFCOM's man in Papua New Guinea. There he is getting out there in the Highlands, Eastern Highlands province, and launching some projects. So yeah, he's certainly the face of China's diplomacy has greatly improved. Here's a few aspects that I didn't get to on the top left of your picture is this idea that the Pacific historically has links to the Pacific. The idea being that Taiwanese indigenous people colonized the Pacific, or are the descendants of the people in the Pacific. And because Taiwan is a part of China, therefore Pacific people are actually Chinese. It's a strange argument, but it has some currency in China at least. The other thing I did mention, of course, is tourism, but that's a huge focus, particularly in Fiji, for the Chinese government. And soft power projects such as this, the Peace Arc, which travels around the Pacific and other parts of the world, delivering free medical care. So that's something I haven't touched on. More than happy to cover it off in Q&A. And I'm also looking forward to your questions more along the lines of the fisheries sector. Again, it's not something that's been a huge focus of our research, but I'll give it a go. The main project we've looked at, of course, is BDM, the Bêche de Mer fishery that was closed down after it was drastically overfished, largely by Chinese operators. And it was if you like, an interesting tale of Chinese investment. There was a lot that was quite familiar to me from other sectors, particularly the influence of larger Chinese players over customs agency and the provincial representatives of the NFA. In particular, the lack of resources of provincial governments in Papua New Guinea to prevent the overfishing of this fishery, simply because prices were such that it was almost inevitable that it was going to be overfished. And you see this trend throughout the region, this regular sort of opening and closing of fisheries as the prices in China get sufficiently hot, and the technologies also to secure the fish get more and more elaborate. And in the case of BDM, the risks that the locals take to secure the fish increase. There have been, certainly in Tonga, a large number of deaths of locals simply from diving too deep and with equipment that is not suited for it. So yeah, there were some fairly tragic results of that particular fisheries overexploitation, both obviously for the fishery itself, but also for the local people. Because one thing that happened after the communities were going in all out for getting Bêche de Mer, they neglected other aspects of their livelihood, particularly their gardens, and you were experiencing famine. So if people had been earning so much from the Bêche de Mer fishery, they neglected their basically their normal subsistence agriculture. And once the gardens aren't tended, it's very hard to get them back to full production levels. And in the case of BDM, because the moratorium was quite sudden, you had levels of starvation and semi-starvation throughout the Papua New Guinea islands. So yeah, quite unexpected consequences for local communities as a result of this over-exploitation of a fisheries resource. So yes, happy to talk more about BDM or any aspect of Chinese investment. Thanks for your time.
네, 지금부터는 통역사님과 순차 통역을 통해 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 발표자님, 발표해 주셔서 감사합니다.
Thank you, Professor Smith, for your presentation. We will be moving on to the questionnaires.
네, 질문이 있으신 분들은 온라인으로 채팅창을 통해서 편하게 남겨주시기 바랍니다.
Those who have questions, please feel free to use the chat box.
현장에 계신 분들 중에 질문이 있으시다면 손을 들고 말씀해 주시기 바랍니다.
Those who have questions in the floor, you can raise your hand and express your questions.
네, 발표자님 연결 부탁드립니다.
Professor Smith, hi. Hello. Can you hear us?
I can, yes.
Can hear you too, thank you. So we will be getting questions from the floor and through chat box. If there's
I have to
any.
say it was very strange to be watching a video of myself, but I'm sure I'm not the first.
네, 그러면 미리 들어온 질문부터 진행하도록 하겠습니다.
We will then proceed first with the questions that we've received in advance.
네, 첫 번째 질문은 중앙 정부를 통한 뇌물이 문제 해결을 못한다고 말씀을 언급을 해주셨는데 그러면 지방 정부 그리고 토지 소유주들과 어떤 방식으로 일을 해야 할지 궁금합니다.
So you've expressed in the presentation that the bribery situation does not solve problems through the main government. Then in this circumstance, how would we be able to effectively work with the local governments or the landowners?
Yeah, that's a good question. So is this in relation to the fisheries sector or just generally in terms of investment?
업에 관련된 것인지 아니면 일반적으로
네, 일반적인 투자 상황에 대해 말씀 부탁드립니다.
Just in general circumstances.
Okay, so yes, this is a problem that a lot of Chinese investors come across because of what they're used to back in China in terms of land ownership, and it's really the biggest problem to Chinese businesses in almost all sectors. Should I leave you time to translate?
No, you can just proceed.
Okay, great. So in China, obviously the land is owned by the collective, if you're talking about rural land. And so effectively it means the state has a great deal of discretion in expropriating land and changing the zoning of land. So if they need land for a commercial purpose, it's relatively easy to arrange. In Melanesia, and I think it's pretty well general across Melanesia, it's much more difficult. You have a very small subset of land. So in Papua New Guinea, it would be 3% that you would call alienated land. So land that is possible to be, if you meet with the leaseholder, it's possible to arrange for this land to be used commercially. 97% of the land is traditionally owned. So in order to have it used for commercial purpose, you need to go through firstly establishing who are the landowners, and then beginning a process of negotiation with them to persuade them that this commercial development should go ahead. So the problem faced by all investors really is you need to have quite a long time horizon. So if you're trying to do things quickly, then things will go wrong and it will end up costing you a lot of money. So one example from the Ramu nickel mine was that because they were in a hurry to build a pipeline, so to build a pipeline from the mine to the coast, 135 kilometers, they basically just bulldozed it through like they would in China, and then tried to come to the landowners later on and say, okay, what was here? Can we compensate you for that? And of course, what the landowners quite understandably did is they exaggerated the value of what had been removed. So suddenly, without negotiating in advance, they ended up paying a lot more for the pipeline than they would have otherwise. And this happens over and over again in Chinese projects because they have very tight deadlines and they don't have the flexibility to, allow for, months, often years of negotiations to get things to run smoothly. So in terms of how you would do that otherwise is you need to build in more time for investments in Melanesia, and you need to do your homework on who are the landowners and not be taken in, shall we say.
지방 정부와 토지 소유주들과 일을 하게 된다면 시간을 조금 여유를 가지고 일을 진행하는 것을 추천하고, 특히 이제 토지 소유주들과 업무를 할 때 상업적인 활용을 위해서 토지를 구매하는 것은 조금 쉬우나 조금 작은 토지, 예를 들어서 말레이시아와 같은 지역의 토지는 좀 좁기 때문에 그것을 구매하는데 조금 더 어렵습니다. 특히 전통적으로 오랫동안 소유를 하고 있는 그런 토지들은 구매를 하기 더욱더 어렵고 시간을 들여서 사람들을 설득시켜서 그것을 구매를 해야 됩니다. 특히 중국 같은 경우에는 중국식으로 일을 하려고 하기 때문에 시간도 데드라인도 몹시 짧고 여유를 주지 않아서 어려움이 있었습니다. 그렇기 때문에 이런 것을 피하면 일을 하는데 조금 쉬울 것 같습니다.
네, 혹시 온라인에서 들어온 질문이 없다면 다음 질문으로 넘어가도록 하겠습니다. 네. 태평양 지역에서 한국인들이 중국인에 대비해 가질 수 있는 강점이 무엇인지 궁금합니다.
So currently, Korean companies are competing with the Chinese companies in this PNG area, especially in the Pacific area. What would be some of the strengths that Korean companies have compared to the Chinese companies, or even Australian or New Zealand companies?
That's a very good question. So in terms of specifically Korean strengths and possibly in terms of things you might not have thought of before, one of the big impediments for Chinese companies in particular is the atheist nature of the Chinese state. So Melanesia is a very Christian, in terms of rates of belief. It's far more Christian than Australia. And I think this is the case in Korea as well. It's a largely, Christianity and Buddhism are strong religions, but there's no persecution of either of these religions. Whereas in China, you get this, and it plays quite badly in Melanesia. So, it's somewhat cynical, instrumental, but churches are often the most powerful, or one of the most powerful institutions in Melanesian life. And if you have those kind of links into a society, then you can build levels of trust in the community, and you can find partners who are in turn trustworthy. So I would highlight that as one specific advantage of Korean companies. Yeah, I'll just leave it at there are many I could identify, but that is the one that kind of jumps out at me as a very distinct Korean advantage over Chinese companies is the shared religious belief.
중국의 단점으로 가장 중요한 것은 종교적 한계와 제약이 많다는 것입니다. 그렇기 때문에 말레이시아 같은 지역은 교회가 몹시 큰 영향을 끼치는 지역이기 때문에 중국이 그런 기독교적인 신념이 없기 때문에 한계가 있었고, 한국이 기독교적인 신념이라든지 교회를 활용해서 신뢰를 구축할 수 있다면 큰 강점이 될 것이라고 생각합니다.
네, 온라인과 현장에서 추가로 들어온 질문이 없다면
With that, if there's no further questions,
투자를 하는데 가장 중요한 고려점 중에서 하나가 문화적인 차이를 어떻게 극복하느냐 인데요. 그 중국 기업들이 파푸아뉴기니아에 진출할 때에 그 문화적 차이를 어떻게 극복했는지 예가 있으면은 하나 들려주십시오.
So you've mentioned about the religious limitations for China, but still they have to do business there. So can you give us some of the examples that Chinese tried to overcome the differences in culture in the PNG area?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there have been some levels of success in if you like reducing barriers and building what China calls people-to-people relationships as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So that has been quite successful in terms of state-organized things like acrobatics exhibitions and sort of fairly inoffensive cultural exhibitions that are organized alongside large Chinese companies. So it's kind of community outreach that are organized jointly by Chinese companies and by the Chinese state. So these kinds of events go down really quite well. The other main way I think that China is having quite a bit of long-term success, and I don't know much about what Korea is doing on this side, is the provision of training. So either short to medium term training with specific sectors. So it might be for the police, it might be exchange of business, sort of business council type exchanges, or it might be full-blown scholarships, so scholarships to go to universities in China. And this is something that China has spent a lot more money on in recent years, and I think is finding it quite effective as a way to build a sympathetic, if you like, not elite, but future elite, if you like, who know China and are comfortable with working with China.
중국은 BRI 같은 프로그램을 활용해서 문화적 교류를 했으며 정부나 기업의 그 수준으로 주최를 해서 아크로바틱 전시회 등의 문화 교류를 진행을 했습니다. 또한 그 외에도 훈련이나 교육 프로그램을 활용해서 중장기 훈련을 통해서 이제 전문 인력을 양성한다든지 스칼러십 등 장학금 등을 줘서 중국으로 유학을 보내는 그런 프로그램 등을 활용해서 문화 교류를 지금 현재 진행을 하고 있습니다.
예, 이번에는 좀 구체적인 질문을 하나 드리겠습니다. 아까 발표에서 오버피싱을 관리하기 역부족이어서 큐컴버, 해삼 씨가 말라서 거의 그 해삼업이 폐지된 상태라고 말씀하신 것 같은데요. 그게 와일드 큐컴버 자원인지 아니면은 그 양식 해삼인지 우선 말씀해 주세요.
You've mentioned about the overfishing of the BDM. So because of lack of management, the fisheries was closed after all. But we are wondering if it was the wild natural fishing or aquacultural fishing.
So for BDM, it's wild natural fishing. So that's entirely, the fishing itself is done by villagers who go out into the sea. And there's about, in PNG, there's about 30 species that can be commercially fished. And the value of each species is very different. So you have fairly cheap ones like lollyfish that you might only get a few kina for. But then you have things like white teatfish, which are very expensive and tend to be overfished very quickly. So depending on the species, that will determine how far out into the ocean you need to go to get it. So as I mentioned in the recorded talk, the technologies for retrieving these fish are advancing, and the capacity, basically how much a villager can fish in every day, is also greatly increasing. So the speed, if you like, of overfishing has increased relative to what there was in the past. And it's a bit like any bubble. So once it gets close to being fished to its capacity, then demand and the prices are going way up, but the fish available to be taken from the sea goes way down. But yes, it's wild fishing. So and in the case of sea cucumbers, the stock it takes quite some time to recover. And again, it varies from species to species. Some are a bit more resilient than others. And there was a lot of argument over whether they were ready to reopen the fishery because they were getting different data for different species. But I could go on about that forever, but I probably shouldn't.
그 해삼에 대한 어업은 자연 야생 어획으로 진행이 되고 있고 현재 어획을 할 수 있는 상업적으로 어획을 할 수 있는 것은 30어종으로 가격 차이도 크게 나고 특히 지금 어류 처리하는 기술이 크게 발전을 하고 있기 때문에 초과 어획이 많이 늘어나고 있어서 있지만 그럼에도 불구하고 수요와 그 가격이 올라가고 있는 상황입니다.
그러면 굉장히 단순한 질문 한 가지만 더 드리겠습니다. 아까 오버피싱을 관리하는데 역부족이어서 초과 어획이 자꾸 일어나고 있다고 말씀하신 것 같은데요. 그 관리 역부족 분야가 관리 인력의 문제인지 그렇지 않으면은 그 감시, 감독, 통제, 모니터링, 서베일런스, 컨트롤, 그러니까 장비 문제인지 인력 문제인지 좀 궁금합니다.
So continuing the question for BDMs, you've mentioned that the management for overcatching was a problem for BDMs, but was it a lack of personal capacity problem, or was it a problem of lack of monitoring mechanisms or monitoring facilities?
장비,
equipment,
device.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. So with this fishery, the model of monitoring was basically the monitoring was at the point of export. So the NFA decided very early that it didn't have the capacity to monitor the entire fishery, and because this fishing is going on pretty well across all of the coast of all of Papua New Guinea, including the islands, then that is the case. No country, even a very developed one, would have the capacity to monitor the fishery at the point of the fishing, if you like. So they made a decision to monitor it at the point of export. The difficulty for them really, so NFA is not under-resourced. NFA gets a lot of money from the tuna fishing licenses, and this was part of the problem for BDM, is that BDM relative to tuna was not a big resource for NFA, and so wasn't a huge priority in the way that conserving the tuna fishery was. Just simply wasn't in the same league in terms of the value of the fishery. So there was probably less emphasis on it, but essentially it came down to the market, and I don't know that any regulator could have managed it. Once the prices got sufficiently high, you had very unscrupulous traders getting involved, and even cases where they would take the fish directly to basically get it out of the sea and take it straight to the restaurant almost. So it was almost, there was no middleman involved. It was pure profit that was being made. And it's very difficult for anyone to manage when you have this sudden increase in actors, increase in people with an interest in the fishery, and no increase in the corresponding ability to monitor them. So I'm not sure how they could have avoided it. The market was really, really hot.
보통 대부분 이것은 수출이 되는데 BDM 같은 경우에는 다랑어에 비해서 중요도가 떨어졌고 관심이 적었기 때문에 관리를 해야 된다는 생각이 크진 않았고, 가격이 폭등함으로 인해서 수요가 급격하게 늘어났기 때문에 관리가 그 속도를 따라가지 못한 것으로 보입니다.
네, 감사합니다. 이상으로 시간 관계상 Q&A 세션을 종료하도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you. Due to time constraints, we will end the Q&A session here.
네, 발표자님과 마침내 실시간으로 만나 뵙게 되어 정말 반가웠습니다.
We are very thankful and grateful to meet you, even in this situation through online.
시간 내주셔서 감사합니다.
Hopefully I can meet you in person next time. It would be very, very nice. But yeah, for the moment we're still locked down. So thanks very much.
We'll be looking forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, cheers. Bye.
네. 추가 질문이 있을 경우에는 이메일로 전달 드리도록 하겠습니다.